So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to be talking about a principle that Peter is very famous for giving a very influential argument against, namely the principle of sufficient reason. I'm not going to be directly addressing Peter's argument against the principle, but rather just trying to put forward an entirely independent argument and see if it's any good. OK, so what is the principle of sufficient reason? The principle is the claim that every fact has an explanation for why it's true. So lots of us think that lots of things have explanations, but very few of us think that absolutely everything has an explanation. So if you like the PSR, you'll think that there's an explanation for why the fundamental laws of physics are the way they are, why the Big Bang happened the way it did, why there's something rather than nothing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, very strong claim. And perhaps that's why almost no one believes the claim nowadays, although it has a very long historical pedigree. I should also say there are lots of different versions of the principle of sufficient reason. So some people think it should be restricted in certain principled ways. So some people have thought that it should be formulated as a claim that every contingent fact has an explanation, maybe because explanation stops at necessary facts, and so maybe that's a principled place to stop. Other people have given other independent restrictions. I'm just going to focus on a generic version according to which every fact has an explanation. I think it's an interesting question what might happen to the argument if it's restricted in those ways, but I'll maybe leave that to the Q&A. Also, there are lots of people want to formulate the PSR in terms of specific kinds of explanation. So people have distinguished causal explanation or metaphysical explanation or other kinds of explanation. I'm again going to leave it in its generic version. So an explanation is just going to be an answer to a why question. And different people will have different theories of what it is to explain things. At the very end of the talk, I'll address how those different theories might bear on the argument. But for now, I'm just going to sort of be naive and take it for granted that we all have some kind of pre-theoretic grip on what it is to explain something. And we can see whether particular theories of explanation make trouble for the argument later. So why is it important to talk about the PSR? Well, if the PSR is true, it might have a lot of interesting consequences. So philosophers throughout history have devised lots of different arguments whose premises have the PSR, include the PSR. These arguments include arguments for the existence of God. So famously, Leibniz has a kind of contingency argument for the existence of God, which uses the PSR as a premise. Peter has famously argued that if the PSR is true, then that implies that every truth is a necessary truth, so what you might call modal collapse. And I think Peter and a lot of other people take this to be a sort of a modus tollens, like obviously not all truths are necessary. PSR implies that, therefore the PSR is false. I'm not going to comment on that, but it is a widely used argument against the PSR. Other people have argued that if the PSR is true, it implies that the laws of physics must be deterministic, because if some matters were just a matter of chance, then they wouldn't have the right kind of explanation. And other people have argued that if the PSR is true, we have no free will, because we couldn't explain why we do what we do in the right way. So there's lots of interesting arguments that use the PSR as a premise. So I think a lot turns on whether the PSR is true. And because of that, I think it's worth talking about whether there's any reason to believe it. If it's true, then a lot would follow from it. So I think we should look into whether there's any reason to believe the PSR. And so that's what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to be giving one argument for the PSR. And the argument's going to be inspired by an argument that Michael Della Rocca has given in another paper of his. But his argument, I think, runs into some important objections. So I'm going to be sort of reformulating and extending the argument in ways that I think avoid those objections and respond to some other stuff as well. OK, so that's what I'm going to be doing. I should also say that at the outset, I'm not personally convinced that the argument works. I think it has a lot of force, and I think it brings out certain commitments that you have to take on if you reject the PSR. But I think there's perfectly respectable ways to get out of the argument. But I think it's an interesting argument to think about nonetheless. OK, so that's the end of section 1. OK, so I think the best way to approach the argument is by looking at a certain kind of symmetrical dialectical situation. First, that's much more familiar to all of us. And then it's going to turn out that my argument is going to be, in many respects, similar to that other dialectical situation that we're all more familiar with. And this situation is the sort of framework that Peter pioneered in his book, Material Beings, on the questions of parts and wholes. So Peter distinguished between the general composition question and the special composition question. The general composition question is, what is it for some things to compose or be part of another? And there we're looking for some kind of informative analysis of the relevant notions of composition or parthood. And then we have the special composition question, under what conditions do some things compose another? And one way to approach the special composition question is to first distinguish 3 kinds of answers: always, never, and sometimes. So always is universalism, never is nihilism, and sometimes is sometimes called restrictivism. And here's a sort of very popular argumentative sort of strategy for one of the extremes. So the first you try to argue against the intermediate views. You argue against restrictivism. And here you appeal to some kind of claim that there's no principled, non-arbitrary dividing line between the things that compose and the things that don't compose. And obviously, that's very controversial. So Peter and others have proposed dividing lines that are attempts to be principled, non-arbitrary dividing lines, like the dividing line between the living and the non-living. But nonetheless, a lot of people find that kind of premise attractive. So you rule out intermediate views in that way. And then you rule out one of the extremes by some other independent argument. So maybe you give a parsimony argument that favors nihilism over universalism. Or maybe you favor universalism over nihilism on the grounds that I'm not a simple and I exist, therefore nihilism is false. But in any case, that's sort of how you argue for one of the extremes. You first argue against intermediate views via the sort of non-arbitrariness principle, argue against one of the other extremes, conclude that the opposite extreme is the right answer. So that's sort of a familiar dialectical situation. And the argument I'm going to give is basically going to be very similar. OK, end of section 2, section 3. So let's distinguish between the general explanation question and the special explanation question. So the general explanation question is, what is it for some facts to explain another fact? And this question has received an enormous amount of attention throughout the history of philosophy. People distinguish different kinds of explanations. People drop different logics of explanation. People give all sorts of interesting theories of the nature of explanation. But there's also a sort of much more neglected kind of question that you can ask, which is the special explanation question. And I'm going to formulate the question in a bit of a different way than you might have expected, but I'll say why in a bit. But here's how I'll formulate the special explanation question. Under what conditions does a certain fact require an explanation? So 2 clarifications on that formulation. So first, what does this word require mean? All I mean by require an explanation is something modal. So to say that a fact requires an explanation is just to say that necessarily, if that fact obtains, there is some explanation for why it obtains. So that's all I mean by require an explanation. A modal notion, something like a fact necessitates a corresponding explanation. Second clarification is just to point out how the question is not formulated. So an alternative, very natural formulation is just, under what conditions does a certain fact in fact have an explanation? So that would be a non-modal formulation. The reason why I chose to give a modal formulation will come out later in the paper. So I'll just flag that for now. I'm formulating the question in a modal way, not in the sort of perhaps more natural non-modal way. OK, so So that's the general explanation question and the special explanation question. And so again, we can formulate 3 different answers: always, never, sometimes. Always is just the PSR. So the PSR just says every fact requires an explanation. That's just what the PSR says. You could say never, so it's never the case that any fact requires an explanation. In principle, any fact could be left totally unexplained or brute. Or you could say sometimes facts require explanations, and other times they don't. So that would be a kind of intermediate answer to the special explanation question. And so here's the argument for the PSR I want to explore. Premise 1, the answer is not never. Premise 2, the answer is not sometimes. Conclusion, the answer is always, therefore PSR. So very simple argument. So now I'll just go to the premises. So end of section 3. OK, so let me first take the first premise. The answer is not never. So I want to point out, so the first premise I don't take to be entirely trivial. I think it would be pretty trivial if to say that the answer is not never is just to say that some facts, in fact, have explanations. To say that the answer is never is to say that some facts necessitate a corresponding explanation. So that's a stronger claim than merely saying some facts have explanation. It's some facts require explanation. So why should we buy premise 1? I think the best argument just appeals to examples. So I'm just going to give a bunch of examples and hope that you all like at least one of them. And if you all like at least one of them, then I'm home free. So that's the strategy. So, and I think these examples are also going to illustrate some important things later. So I thought I tried to pick some sort of important philosophical kinds of examples that philosophers use all over the place. So when you look throughout philosophy, philosophers often make this kind of move of like, look, X view couldn't possibly be right because it implies that a certain kind of fact is inexplicable. But that fact can't be inexplicable, therefore that view is wrong. So I think that kind of philosophical move happens all the time. And so I'm just going to list some cases where that happens. So take the case of mereology, which we've already talked about. A lot of people are attracted to the view that whatever answer to the special composition question is right, it can't be a sort of arbitrary answer. So here's what I have in mind. So imagine someone says that particles arranged table-wise form a fusion, but particles arranged chair-wise don't. And then you ask them, well, what's so special about tables? And they say, oh, there's nothing special. There's no explanation. It's just totally brute fact. Tables compose, chairs don't. No reason why, end of story. I think a lot of people don't like that kind of view. They think, no, these kinds of facts need explanations. It couldn't be that just for no reason tables form fusions and chairs don't. There has to be something about what it is to be a table that explains why particles arranged table-wise form fusions and particles arranged chair-wise don't. And that's why a lot of people don't like this kind of drawing arbitrary lines. But then again, that's controversial. So people like Ned Markosian have argued for a sort of brutalist view of composition where there are just brute facts about when things compose, and we can't really say much about why that is. People like Ross Cameron have defended a contingentist view about composition where in some possible worlds, basically any answer you want to the special composition question obtains in some world. In some world, there are tables but no chairs. So some people have defended the opposite, but I think a lot of people are inclined to think it just couldn't be that there are tables but no chairs, and there's no reason why tables are special. Here's another kind of case, personal identity. Take a symmetric fission case. So we have a person, and they're going to symmetrically divide into two. The left hemisphere is going to go one way, the right hemisphere another way. If the case is perfectly symmetrical, a lot of people are inclined to think it just couldn't be true that you're the one, you go to the left and not the right. And there's no reason at all why you go left rather than right. People think that just couldn't be right. Facts about who you become need some kind of explanation, maybe in terms of facts about mental continuity or bodily continuity or something. But it can't just be a sort of random arbitrary brute fact that you go to the left and not the right. A lot of people are sympathetic to that. But then again, some people aren't. So I think Trent and Merrickx might be inclined to think it could just be a sort of fact that there's not something very enlightening to say about you go to the left, but there's no further reason why. But maybe not. Anyway, here's another kind of case, aesthetic properties. So we often say that things are beautiful, and we can explain why certain things strike us as beautiful. So you can say, oh, that's beautiful because of certain properties of symmetry that it has, or a certain pattern of colors, et cetera. But if someone said, this is beautiful, and you ask why, and there's no reason at all, it's just completely brute, arbitrary, this is beautiful, no explanation, that seems very strange to me. And so I think you should be able to say something about, in virtue of what is it beautiful. Similar case about morality, but this time more controversial. So some people think that, yeah, there can't be brute, primitive properties of what's right or wrong or good or bad. Either there are no moral properties at all, or they have to be reductively explained in terms of the properties of natural science. And people give different arguments for this. Some people think, look, if there were just brute, primitive moral properties, then maybe they should be freely recombinable with the natural properties, and that would imply that moral supervenience fails. That would imply that maybe in some worlds pain is good and pleasure is bad, and that seems bad. So there's a variety of arguments for this, but again, a lot of people are inclined to think it just couldn't be true that there are sort of brute, primitive properties of what's good or bad, what's right or wrong. They have to have some kind of naturalistic explanation. Here's yet another case. Take the case of dispositional properties. There's a big debate in the metaphysics of science about whether there could be sort of brute, primitive, fundamental dispositions, or whether dispositional properties have to be somehow explained in terms of categorical properties. So here's an example. Suppose there are two sugar cubes, and they share all of their categorical features in common. They have the same shape and molecular structure, et cetera, et cetera. But then suppose someone says, one of these is disposed to dissolve in water, were you to put it in a glass of water, and the other one is not disposed to dissolve in water. And you ask, why is there this difference? Why is it that one is disposed to dissolve in water and the other one isn't? And they just say, oh, there's no reason why, it's just a brute, arbitrary, primitive fact. One is disposed to dissolve, one isn't. I can't tell you anything further. That explanation stops there. Some people find that really mysterious, and other people are perfectly fine with that. So certain non-Humeans about natural necessity are perfectly fine positing sort of dispositional properties that are not explained in terms of categorical properties. Take the philosophy of mathematics, so the case of set theory. So maybe a bit over 100 years ago, we thought there was a very simple principled story about which sets there are. Just for any plurality, there's a set of those things. But then we realized that's inconsistent. And so we have to have some other account as to which sets there are. And people have been struggling ever since to come up with some principled, non-arbitrary account as to what sets there are. And intuitively, I think we don't just want to say anything goes here. So suppose someone says, Socrates exists and Plato exists. And I believe in singleton Socrates, but I don't believe in singleton Plato. So Socrates forms a singleton and Plato doesn't. And I ask, OK, well, what's so special about Socrates? They say, oh, there's no reason. It's just totally arbitrary. There's singleton Socrates, not a singleton Plato. There's nothing more to say. That's the end of the story. I think, again, we'd be sort of very bewildered and puzzled. Why is it that we'd want to know why is it that there's singleton Socrates and singleton Plato? And if they don't have an answer, that seems really bad. I'll close with two sort of maybe less controversial facts, or cases. Take the case of determinates and determinables. So being red is a determinable, and it has various determinants, like being scarlet or being crimson or whatever. And a lot of people think if something has a determinable, like being red, it has it in virtue of a particular determinant, like being scarlet or being crimson. So a lot of people like that, but some people deny that. So some people in the literature on so-called metaphysical vagueness or metaphysical indeterminacy have thought that there could be things that are, say, red, but lack any determinant of red. And so they're just red. There's nothing more to say it. There's just red. People like Jessica Wilson and Gideon Rosen have defended views kind of like this. But I think most people are inclined to think, no, if you're red, you have to be red because you have a certain kind of determinant. Similarly, if you like grounding, a lot of people think disjunctive facts have to be explained in terms of their disjuncts. So anyway, those are a lot of cases. I'll close by giving sort of two historical cases that are much more controversial, but they fit in this sort of same pattern. So take the case of space. So Leibniz famously argued that space can't be an infinite homogeneous substance. Why? Because there'd be no explanation for why things are here rather than being 10 feet to the left. And he concluded space can't be like that because it would result in certain inexplicable facts. But those kinds of facts can't be inexplicable. Therefore, space can't be an infinite homogeneous substance. So that's a much more controversial appeal to inexplicability than perhaps the ones I've said earlier. Here's another kind of case that I think maybe Leibniz also defended, sort of a principle of identity of indiscernibles. So you could say, look, no two things can share all of their qualitative properties and relations, because otherwise, if they did, it would just be a brute or primitive fact that they are distinct. But if you follow Leibniz, such facts can't be distinct. Therefore, you have to endorse the principle of identity of indiscernibles. So again, that's also an extremely controversial argument that can be resisted in multiple different places. But it's at least a sort of version of this kind of argument that extends the previous less controversial ones. Anyway, so that's a lot of examples. All I need is that you like one of those. So if one of those you like, then I'm golden. So hopefully most of you at least like one of those examples. And that's the end of that section. OK, so the next section is a big section and where I think a lot of the action will be. But it's it's the premise 2 against the sometimes premise. So the same prima facie case applies in the case of this argument and the mereology argument. So the thought is, in the mereology argument, there didn't seem to be any obvious principal dividing line between the things that form fusions and the ones that don't. And the same prima facie case applies here. There's all these contestable kinds of examples. There's all this disagreement about where to draw the line. At first glance, there doesn't seem to be a natural, obvious place to draw the line and say these kinds of facts need explanations and those kinds of facts don't. And in the absence of any sort of principled non-arbitrary line, it seems like that's an argument that there is such a line. So that's the very same prima facie case. There's obviously a lot of ways to resist that prima facie case. And so for most of the rest of the talk, I'll be talking about ways one might resist that prima facie case, and then ways one might resist the resistance, et cetera. OK. So I think we should distinguish between two very different ways one might resist the prima facie case. So distinguish what you might call the easy road and the hard road. So and this terminology goes, there's a similar distinction in the philosophy of mathematics. But anyway, OK, so what is the easy road and the hard road? So here's what the easy road to reject the prima facie case is. The easy roader says, look, there is a dividing line, but there's no explanation for why the dividing line is exactly there rather than somewhere else. This is one of those facts that doesn't need to be explained. After all, given that the PSR is false, we're already committed to there being such facts that don't need explanations. So why can't this be one of them? So you already think that there are facts that don't have explanations if you dislike the PSR. So why can't we just say this is one of them? So that's the easy road, because you don't have to give some big story as to why the dividing line is there rather than there. You just say, it's somewhere, but it's going to be brute arbitrary, and that's all there is to say. Then there's the hard road, who sort of rolls up their sleeves and says, no, there is some dividing line, but there is some big story that I'm going to tell you as to why exactly it is right there rather than anywhere else. And this is obviously called the hard road because they're committing to tell you, some big story that explains exactly why the line is there rather than some slightly different place. And I think it's hard because I think all of these examples I've been going through in the previous section, there's tons of disagreement about all of those kinds of cases. And so the hard road would have to give not only a way to adjudicate all of those cases, but moreover, some big story as to why this is the only sort of way to adjudicate the cases and why it couldn't have been any other way. OK, so that's the easy road and the hard road. And so I want to divide what I say in terms of against the easy road and against the hard road. So I'll start by trying to say some words of why the easy road might not be attractive, and then say some words about why the hard road might not be attractive. OK, so why don't I like the easy road? So the reason I don't like the easy road has to do with the way I formulated the special explanation question in the first place. So I explicitly chose to formulate it in a modal way. So the question is, which kinds of facts require explanations? And if you formulated it in a non-modal way, then I wouldn't know what to say against the easy road. But I think I do know what to say if you formulate it in a modal way. And so I'll use that formulation in my arguments against the easy road. So I divided it into sort of 4 steps. So step 1 is to notice that different answers as to where the dividing line is correspond to different views about the space of metaphysical possibility. So for example, take the question of, can there be primitive or brute dispositions? If you say there can be, then you presumably think there are possible worlds where there are brute or primitive dispositions. But if you say there can't be such dispositions, then presumably you say there are no such worlds. And so I think this shows that precisely because we formulated the question in a modal way, different answers to the question will correspond to different conceptions of the structure of metaphysical space. So that's step 1, so just an observation that different proposed answers to the special explanation question will result in different views about modal space. So step 2 is just to notice, so therefore, if you take the easy road, then you're committed to thinking that the nature of metaphysical possibility is ultimately brute or arbitrary. Because the easy road, by definition, said that there is a dividing line, and moreover, there's no reason at all as to why the dividing line is there rather than somewhere else. But if different answers to the dividing line correspond to different views about modal space, it follows that if you like the easy road, then you think there's a fact about modal space that is itself brute or inexplicable, namely, why include these kinds of inexplicable facts and not those? So that's the second step. The third step, I guess, is the major step, is just to say that, but the nature of metaphysical possibility is not brute or arbitrary. And I think the crucial step here is that I think this step can be defended totally independently of a prior commitment to the PSR. So I think it seems to me that there's good reasons to think that the nature of metaphysical possibility necessity is not brute or arbitrary that have nothing to do with the PSR. That even if you dislike the PSR, you should still think that the nature of metaphysical possibility is not brute or arbitrary. And a lot of people have defended this elsewhere, so under the banner of no brute necessities. So lots of people have defended this, people like Kian Dor, people like David Chalmers, people like Brad Scow, lots of people. But so I'll just briefly say why I'm attracted to the view that we shouldn't think that the nature of modal space itself is brute or arbitrary or inexplicable. So first I want to give a sort of intuition pump as to why I think this, and then I'll give some more theoretical reasons as to why I think this. So the intuition pump is just to go through a particular case. So suppose someone tells you the number of fundamental particles in the universe is divisible by 7. Okay. I think a lot of us would be fine with thinking that's just a brute contingency. That's just how the world turned out. There's, 140 particles or whatever. And that's divisible by 7, yeah. Just a random sort of inexplicable brute fact. But then suppose someone says, look, it's absolutely necessary that the number of fundamental particles is divisible by 7. And then you ask, oh, what's so special about 7? Why isn't it divisible by 6? And they say, oh, there's no reason why. It's just totally arbitrary. This modal space is like this. It just happens to be that there's no possible world where the particles are not divisible by 7. I think that's really bad. It seems to me that metaphysical possibility doesn't work like this, that there's just sort of random arbitrary restrictions to it. So yeah, that's the sort of intuition pump that, and notice that this is an intuition pump designed for people who don't like the PSR in the first place. So you can grant that there's nothing wrong with brute contingencies. So totally fine that it's brutally contingent, that the number of particles is divisible by 7. But there's something peculiarly wrong about saying that the structure of modal space is such that no possible world has a number of particles that's not divisible by 7. So that's the intuition pump that is against brute necessity. But I think there's more theoretical reasons about sort of the role that metaphysical modality plays in our theorizing. So it seems to me that metaphysical modality would sort of lose its interest if it just turned out to be a sort of arbitrary category. So a lot of people define metaphysical modality as the sort of broadest objective or genuine possibility. There's quotes, I think, from Peter and Kripke and Plantinga and lots of people who define metaphysical possibility like this. They have a notion of a sort of genuine or objective or real possibility, and they understand metaphysical possibility as the sort of broadest such notion. And there's obviously, I mean, a lot of questions as to how you understand this notion of an objective or genuine or real kind of modality. The purpose of distinguishing like real or genuine or objective modalities from others is to sort of set aside like epistemic modality and deontic modality, where like epistemic modality is just relative to agents, relative to my state of knowledge. That's not a sort of worldly kind of possibility. And that's supposed to be contrasted with things like nomological possibilities, which are, in some sense, worldly and not dependent just on particular human agents. So yeah, there's some obscurity in the notion, but a lot of people think that's how metaphysical modality should be defined. But I think there's a problem with defining it this way and taking the easy road. So just let's go through a case. Suppose you're an easy roader who says, for example, that worlds with primitive dispositions were left out of modal space for no reason at all. So so the easy roader says, look, if you look throughout modal space, you're not going to find a world with primitive dispositions. And I ask why, and they say, oh, there's no reason at all, totally arbitrary. If they say that, then it seems to me that I could just define a broader notion of possibility that includes such worlds. And it seems like there would be no reason why that broader class wouldn't count as an objective or real or genuine kind of necessity, because by hypothesis, the person is just leaving those worlds out for no reason at all. And so why can't I just define a broader notion of modality that includes those worlds? By definition, they can't sort of give me a reason why I can't. And so it seems to me that I should be able to do that, in which case, if the easy road were taken, then metaphysical modality wouldn't be the sort of broadest, genuine, or real kind of possibility. OK, so I think there are both sort of intuitive reasons and theoretical reasons to think that the structure of modal space can't be arbitrary. And moreover, I think these reasons should be amenable to everyone, regardless of whether you like the PSR or not. They're specifically about there can't be brute necessities, not that there can't be brute contingencies. OK, so that's step 3. Step 4, therefore, the easy road doesn't work, because the easy road implies that through these series of steps that structure of modal space is arbitrary, but it's not, therefore it doesn't work. OK, so that's my case against the easy road. OK, so then there's the hard road. And unfortunately, I don't have a sort of master argument against the hard road. I'll just try to say some things to make it sound hard, basically. I'm sort of in a sort of weird position because, to my knowledge, there really are no like specific concrete proposals out there for how to do the hard road. So I'm in a weird position of arguing against a proposal that doesn't exist. So no one's actually, I think, to my knowledge, given a sort of attempt to do the hard road. So I think it's hard to argue against something that there's not been any attempts to. But I'm just going to say some things to try to motivate the view that doing the hard road is hard. And I myself am sort of agnostic about whether it's going to pan out. So like, I would be very happy if someone gave me a hard road answer, because then I think that would be really good for philosophy if there was an answer to the hard road, and then I would adopt that and be happy. But yeah, I'll just say some things as to why I think it's hard. OK, so I just want to basically go through certain attempts at the hard road, which I think, when you think about them, really aren't genuine answers to the hard road. So here's an example of how not to do the hard road. Suppose you say something like, look, facts that are fundamental don't need explanations. Facts that are non-fundamental do need explanations. So I think this is a non-answer to the hard road. But I'll say a minor problem with it, and then I'll say a major problem with it. So the minor problem is just it might be extensionally wrong. It just might get the cases wrong. So fundamental facts are, if you buy the ideology of fundamentality, fundamental facts often have explanations. So fundamental facts often have causal explanations. So take some particular particle in my shirt or something. Maybe it's a fundamental fact that that particular particle has some particular position. That fact does have an explanation, namely a causal explanation as to how it ended up there. So it's not true that fundamental facts just don't have explanations. But you might say, look, at least fundamental facts don't require explanations. So we could imagine that particle just sort of popped into existence. And so it didn't need to have explanation. It just happened to have explanation. And I think that might be true. But I think there's also reasons to maybe doubt that. So take myself as a human organism. So a lot of people think certain facts about my causal history are essential to me. So you might think I couldn't exist without my parents or something. And so you might think, look, you might be able to imagine a situation where I sort of pop into existence out of nothing. But really, that wouldn't be me. That would just be a sort of duplicate of me. That wouldn't be me who pops into, just someone who looks like me. And if you think there are certain features of my causal history are essential to me, then you might, a very natural view would be to extend that to other kinds of things, perhaps like particles or whatever, in which case you think, no, it just, the fact that that particular particle had that particular position had to have a certain explanation, namely a causal explanation, because it wouldn't be that particular particle without that causal explanation. But as I said, this is just a minor problem of there's ways that the proposal might go wrong. I think the central major problem is that it just gives a label to the solution without actually answering it. So a lot of people just mean by fundamental that, or to say that a fact is fundamental is just to say that it lacks a certain kind of explanation, namely lacks a sort of metaphysical explanation. And so you can raise all the exact same problems. You can raise the question, can there be moral facts that are fundamental? Some people say yes, some people say no. Can there be dispositional facts that are fundamental? Some people say yes, some people say no. So you can raise all the same questions. This quote-unquote solution just gives a label to things without actually ever telling you how to divide up the cases into the cases that need explanation and the ones that don't. And I think actually, when you think about it, a lot of attempts to the hard road face a similar kind of problem. So suppose you're a fan of talk of essences. Then you might say, look, my account of the hard road is that fact F needs explanation just in case it's essential to F that it be explained. Again, I think this is just a label without actually telling you an answer to the hard questions. You can raise all the same questions. Is it essential to dispositional facts that they have explanations? Is it essential to moral facts that they have explanations, et cetera, et cetera? So you can just raise all the same questions in that essentialist framework, and it doesn't actually give you answers as to how to draw the dividing line. Suppose you have some other account of modality. Suppose you're someone like David Lewis who tries to reduce necessity to the existence of worlds. You might think, look, a fact F needs explanation just in case every world where F obtains, F has an explanation. Again, the exact same problem. There could be different views about what worlds there are. You could have worlds where there are fundamental moral properties, worlds where there aren't. So again, I just think these kinds of views just sort of embed the answer into a broader framework of essences or fundamentality or worlds or something, but they don't actually give answers to the particular sort of questions that I went through in section 4. And so basically the lesson of these kinds of attempts, it seems to me, is that any complete answer to the hard road should be able to give clear and unambiguous, non-arbitrary answers to all of the controversial kinds of facts that we looked through in section 4. And I think these don't. So you could have these views and still have a million different kinds of answers as to how to answer the questions in section 4. So at the very least, they're sort of sketches of a solution without any of the details being filled in. Here's another strategy, which I think I'm most sympathetic to the strategy, even though I think within the broader philosophical sphere, people aren't sympathetic to this. So, so some people try to draw a tight link between necessity and sort of conceivability, or some kind of a priori notion. And if you like that kind of link between necessity and being a priori or being conceivable or something, then you might try something like the following. Fact F doesn't need an explanation, just in case it's maybe ideally conceivable that it lacks an explanation. And that's my favorite reply, but it has a lot of problems. And so ultimately, I'm not sure if it'll work. So I'll just say those problems. These problems are really just general problems for the kind of view. I think the third problem is the one that really sort of keeps me up at night, but I'll see what problems you guys have with it. So the first problem is just the sort of standard problems for equating possibility with conceivability of the sort of Kripkean kind of necessities. I think that can be dealt with sort of two-dimensional semantics, but that's like extremely controversial, and people have different opinions about that. There's other people who try to resist this kind of thing by putting pressure on the notion of the distinction between the sort of what is a priori and what is not. So people like Timothy Williamson have argued that this kind of distinction can't really bear a lot of theoretical weight. And again, that's a huge literature. It's hard to say anything very informative here. The sort of biggest problem that I have with this kind of view is actually that it runs into the same problems as the other kinds of answers. So basically, it seems to me that if you like this kind of answer, you have to have a sort of heavily idealized notion of what's conceivable. And it's unclear whether there is a sort of univocal notion of what's a priori or what's conceivable that would give you clear answers to the kinds of controversial cases I sketched out. So just to go through some cases, take the case of determinables. So when I personally reflect on, try to think of the following possibility: something can be read, but not in virtue of any particular determinant. I find it hard to conceive of that. But a lot of people find it easy to conceive of, or at least they've argued at length that it's perfectly coherent. So people like Gideon Rosen and Jessica Wilson have defended views of metaphysical indeterminacy where it's perfectly fine for something to have a determinable property without any determinant. And so we have this clash of like, seems inconceivable to me, seems conceivable to them. It's hard to know how to adjudicate that. The fan of this proposal is going to have to hope that there's some sort of idealized notion of conceivability for which we can adjudicate that. And it's unclear how we can make progress on that. But and that kind of case happens all the time. So take the case of morality. So a lot of people find it difficult to make sense of sort of fundamental brute properties of right or wrong, good or bad. A lot of people think, look, it doesn't make sense to have a notion of what's right or wrong or good or bad. That's totally divorced from human beings' desires and interests and goals. It has to be somehow that what's good or bad is somehow derived from our goals or interests or values or whatever. And relatedly, so take the case of like moral supervenience. So a lot of people think, look, it's just inconceivable that the physical world is just as it is, but the moral properties are different. It's inconceivable that like, pain is primitively good and pleasure is primitively bad. But then other people find it perfectly easy to conceive of. Like Gideon Rosen finds it perfectly easy to conceive of a world where pain is good and pleasure is bad. And so again, we have a case where like I can conceive of it, they can't, and how are we to decide that issue with some sort of really souped up idealized notion? It's hard to see how that dispute's going to go. Similarly, again, lastly, take the case of dispositional properties. So there's this big debate within like the sort of non-Humean circles about whether the world can be at bottom just sort of primitive, bare dispositions. Some people think it's incoherent. Some people think it's perfectly coherent. So Bertrand Russell famously thought there was something incoherent about the idea of just a bunch of dispositions that are defined in terms of each other, and And other people like Alexander Bird and Stephen Mumford and lots of other people think it's perfectly coherent to think there's a world of just pure dispositions. So again, I think ultimately this kind of strategy faces the same problems as the other ones, that it's unclear whether there's there's certain debates where one party finds it conceivable, one party doesn't, and it's hard to adjudicate them with some super idealized notion in some principled way. But I should say I am open to that. I would love it if that could be adjudicated. So maybe it's the best answer, but I think it still has a lot of problems. OK, so that's the end of section 5 and what I have to say against the hard road. So let me just, I want to sort of briefly summarize where we've been before talking about the last section, which is a bit of a meta section. So the argument is basically saying something like, look, everyone appeals to the PSR all the time in terms of their views about mereology or morality or dispositions or sets or aesthetics or personal identity, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone appeals to the PSR all the time. People who like the PSR appeal to it in a consistent way. They just say it's always the case. But people who don't like the PSR, it's unclear what their methodology is. They appeal to it sometimes, not other times. They don't seem to have any good story as to why they can appeal it here and not there. But I think they do need some story, because if they don't have a story, then that's the easy road, and that makes metaphysical modality rude and arbitrary. So I think they do need some story, and it's hard to see what the story would look like. And so I think that's a good reason to like the PSR. This sort of reminds me of the sort of argument that Trenton Merrickx gave in his talk. So he said that, look, there's like a CP1, which is if you believe the premises and they're valid, et cetera, then you should believe the conclusion. That's a very nice, simple, elegant principle. But suppose you think that's not sufficient, that sometimes you should believe it and sometimes you shouldn't. Then you're committed to these extra conditions that, look, you believe all the premises and it's valid, but that's not enough to make you justifiably believe in the conclusion. It also has to satisfy properties x1, x2, x3, and then no one says what x1 and x2, x3 is. I think that's bad, that you just say x1, x2, x3 and don't say anything about what it is. And I think if you reject the PSR, you're in a somewhat similar position. You think it's not sufficient to reject a view, that it just posits something that's completely inexplicable. You also need some mysterious x1, x2, x3, which I'm not going to tell you anything about. I think that's at least an unsatisfying view. And so I thought that was an interesting analogy between this argument and Trenton's. OK, so let me let's do the last section. OK, so at the beginning of the talk, I said I would just use the word explanation and take it for granted and just sort of naively proceed with the argument. And now I want to return and investigate the notions that are appealed to in the special explanation question. So the special explanation question is which facts require explanations, where that's just which facts are such that necessarily they have explanations. And that question appeals to two loaded philosophical concepts that a lot of philosophers disagree about. So there's the concept of necessity, and there's the concept of explanation. And both of those concepts, there's huge philosophical literatures about how to exactly understand those concepts. And so I want to close by mentioning some ways out of the argument that are sort of metaphilosophical in nature. So with respect to these two concepts, OK, I thought it would be a short talk, but actually not. Anyway, yeah, so a lot of people have developed sort of deflationary / pragmatic / conventionalist / these concepts aren't that important kind of views, both about necessity and explanation. So for example, people like Ted Sider have said, look, we shouldn't take metaphysical modality super seriously. We should have a sort of conventionalist view where to be necessary is to be a certain kind of fact in this list, but what goes on the list is kind of arbitrary. And with respect to explanation, a lot of people in the philosophy of science and in metaphysics have thought that really, when you think about it, explanation doesn't sort of carve nature at its joints. It's sort of this human practice that involves a lot of sort of psychological effects about what gives us a sort of feeling of understanding or something. But there's nothing sort of, there's no sort of explanatory structure in the world that's just sort of a thing that humans engage in. And I think if you have a kind of deflationary view towards either necessity or explanation, I think you can get out of the argument. So I think the right thing to say, if you like a sort of deflationary view of either necessity or explanation, is something like, look, the easy road is going to be the right answer. Why? Because there's going to be some dividing line, but it's ultimately going to be a function of certain sort of arbitrary contingent features of sort of quirks of human psychology, something like that. What counts as necessary and what counts as an explanation is really just sensitive to sort of arbitrary human quirks of psychology. And we could imagine a sort of another alien species that calls different things necessary and calls different things explanatory. And there's no sort of objective fact about we're getting it right and they're getting it wrong. If you have that kind of view, then I think you should probably take the easy road out and say that there's going to be a dividing line that's ultimately sensitive to sort of arbitrary quirks about our human psychology. And I think you'll reject the sort of argument I gave against the easy road, where I said we should have this principle that metaphysical modality has to be explicable and non-arbitrary. I think you'll reject that kind of argument. At least that's what I think if you have this deflationary view, I think that's probably the best way out of the argument. But then again, I think this way out of the argument isn't like too surprising. I think it sort of should be expected that if you have a sort of deflationary understanding of necessity or explanation, then that's obviously going to be in tension with any kind of grand metaphysical principle that tries to link necessity and explanation. So someone who's a deflationist about things is not going to like grand metaphysical principles like the PSR. So I think it's sort of expected that if you have a deflationary view about these things, you're not going to like the PSR. There's obviously like a lot to say about whether we should think the concepts of explanation and necessity are sort of objective or worldly, or whether they're in some ways pragmatic or conventional. And there's no way I could say anything informative about that huge debate here. So I think the best way to construe the argument is basically just as a conditional claim that if you take a certain kind of realist view towards necessity and explanation, then I think you should perhaps be more sympathetic to the PSR than you were before listening to this talk.
So thanks, David. That was really fascinating. I wanted to suggest a not so hard way to take the hard road.
Okay.
And so I'm thinking of this on analogy of sort of the analogous question for causal explanation. So now it's like, when does a fact require a causal explanation? And here's a not so hard way to take the hard road there. A fact requires a causal explanation just when it's caused.
Okay.
If it's not caused, no causal explanation to be given. If it is caused, we can ask how and why. That's thought. Likewise, when does a fact require a metaphysical explanation? Just when it's grounded.
Great.
So where we land is something like your when a fact is fundamental view, but restricted to metaphysical explanations, or the fact that there's some causal explanations not on the table.
Yeah.
And we've given an understanding of fundamental, not in terms of metaphysical explanation, but like in the way that most grounding theorists would do it, in terms of a primitive notion of ground, where you can think of what's fundamental as what's ungrounded.
Yeah, great. So I think the two problems I said for the fundamental thing apply, but I'm curious to see whether they don't. So take the view that something requires an explanation if it's grounded, and if it's not grounded, it doesn't require an explanation. So the first problem I gave was the extensional one about what about maybe there's certain things that have their causal history essential to them, so they need a cause. But that's obviously very controversial. But that's the sort of first argument. It might not be extensionally adequate when the question is when does something require an explanation simpliciter. But there's another question of when does it require a metaphysical explanation, and that response doesn't target that, but I think it still maybe is a problem for the generic PSR. So I think that was the first thing I say. And the second thing I say is similar to I think there's a lot of sort of not so hard rotors, and I think they always fall to the same problem with it, which is so the sort of lesson is any complete answer to the hard road should give clear and unambiguous, non-arbitrary answers to all of the controversial kinds of facts in section 4. And I think that doesn't give clear and unambiguous, non-arbitrary answers to all the controversial kinds of facts, because some people will say dispositional facts are grounded, some people will say moral facts are grounded, some people will say, and it's unclear whether grounding applies to certain, like the personal identity fission cases, maybe grounding doesn't apply to that. But basically, I think, yeah, that's a sort of, I think that sort of situates the answer in a kind of grounding framework, but which I think is progress, perhaps, but it doesn't give you answers to as to where to draw the line. There's still sort of both the epistemic question and the metaphysical question of how do we go about figuring out what is grounded, or the dispositional, moral, et cetera, and which ones aren't. So yeah, I have the worries about it not giving these answers, and these worries about if you accept other kinds of explanation, then it doesn't really address other kinds of cases. But thanks.
Thanks. So when you talk about the easy road, you say that you don't want metaphysical possibility to be brute or arbitrary. But I feel like these are two very different things, brute and arbitrary. And your complaint, the example that you gave about the number 7, I think is only about the arbitrariness part. Because I agree that it would be very strange if it's somehow necessary that the number of particles is whatever, divisible by 7 with no explanation.
Yeah.
But that's because it's arbitrary. Why 7 rather than 8 or some other number?
Yeah.
But I feel like the cases that we're talking here do not generate this kind of arbitrariness. So for example, if I say that the first state of the universe is unexplained, that's the one thing that's unexplained or something.
The only thing that's unexplained.
For example, right? Then what would be the way in which I'm carving metaphysical possibility? It would be something like that the first state can be any state among all the combination of particles. And that's not arbitrary, because it would be arbitrary if I said only this gerrymandered set of initial conditions are allowed. But I'm not saying anything like that. That would be very strange. I'm just saying all of them are allowed. So that would be a brute necessity, but it won't be arbitrary. I don't see anything wrong with that. And similarly, for example, we talk about dispositions, right? It would be strange to say that, for example, only the dispositions of the electrons are brute, while those of the protons are not, or something like that. But we're not saying like that. We're saying that either all dispositions are brute or none are. And given that dispositions form some kind of natural class, that wouldn't be an arbitrary necessity if it were. So my worry is that most of the plausible cases of unexplained facts would give rise to necessities which are not arbitrary. So it wouldn't look like your case of the number 7 and stuff like that.
Yeah. Good. So I agree that the number 7 case like is sort of smacks you in the face of the arbitrariness, and the other ones perhaps less so. There's a question of like rhetorical / substantive question about what exactly is the difference between brute and arbitrary. So I think of brute as something like has no explanation, and arbitrary is something like has no explanation, but there are some sort of suitably similar, relevant other kinds of things for which there's no explanation for why that rather than something else. So like in the 7 case, like why 7 rather than 6 or something like that. And I think the notion of arbitrary does apply to different answers to the special explanation question. So let me just start with the generic thing. Like, so we have all these cases. You're going to have to say some fall on this line and not that line. But then there's all these suitably similar salient kind of alternatives, like draw the line here, there, there. And if you say the line is there, and I say, why isn't it right there? And you say no reason. For me, that strikes me as arbitrary why there rather than there. But I agree that maybe arbitrariness comes in degrees or something. But it strikes me that that's arbitrary. In the particular case you gave about only the initial conditions, I think that just, I don't like that because it makes personal identity arbitrary and mereology arbitrary and dispositions arbitrary. So I think that's just a bad answer to the question. And so maybe that one's less arbitrary, but I just think it's a bad answer. But I'm inclined to think, yeah, if you understand arbitrary as has no explanation and has no sort of contrastive explanation with suitably salient similar alternatives, then I think it applies here, and I would want a bigger story.
So I'm going to take really seriously your claim that the argument against sometimes is like the argument against sometimes in the special composition question. If I'm going to do that in a second. If you're like, no, don't take it so seriously, then I would have a different objection. I don't know if Dina would let me ask that. Okay. But here's how it goes in the special composition question. Assumption 1, composition supervenes on some other fact. Assumption 2, that fact or feature comes in degrees. Assumption 3, we can line up cases where if, suppose reductio, composition only sometimes occurs where, that relation holds really at a really high degree at one end, and it's a paradigm case of composition. And then at the other end, it holds to a very low degree. It's a paradigm case of composition failing. We can get a Sorites series, and then, it seems like it's arbitrary and bad to draw a particular line. That's the way the argument goes. Note that argument also has as an essential claim that composition can't be vague, and that's usually connected to existence can't be vague. So really two points. One, if you are going to say it's like the kind of Lewis argument against restricted composition, then you're committed, I think, to saying whether something requires an explanation can't be vague. And that feels like a pretty strong claim. And then the second thing, in some ways this is maybe the less obvious, but in my opinion, the more interesting, you have to say something's requiring an explanation supervenes on certain features it has that come in degrees. And I'm just completely confused. I have no idea what's going on. Sorry, well, that was super rhetorical. I like you. I mean, what do you say about that, Professor Builes?
Yeah, totally. So I think I can put two hats on. One, thinking the analogy was in some ways analogous, some ways not, and I don't need the total analogy. And I kind of like that, but I'll play the game of trying to make it more analogous. First is a question of the case of composition has this anti-vagueness thing. And I think I totally agree that that's one of the main things in the literature, but I'm inclined to think the sort of arbitrariness point arises regardless of whether it's vague. I think that, it would strike me as a sharp thing would be arbitrary, and also some sort of vague fuzzy thing. I could imagine the fuzzy line being here or here, and why is it there rather than there? And I would have arbitrariness worries whether it was vague or fuzzy, or vague or precise. So I would think that it has some force regardless of the vagueness point. And second, even if the vagueness thing was essential, I think it's an interesting question whether the relevant kinds of facts I'm looking for can be vague. So the relevant kind of fact I'm looking for is a sort of modal fact about. So different answers to the special explanation question will have different implications for the space of possible worlds. And you might think if modality is fundamental or perfectly joint carving or something, maybe you don't want to think that the space of possible worlds is vague. So I think there's maybe some room to think it shouldn't be vague here, and also I think even without vagueness, the compositional case has some force. The third point you made about the comes in degrees thing, I do agree that that's definitely a prima facie asymmetry. One sort of thing I would try to do, which is definitely different in kind than the kind of degrees in the mereology case, but I think maybe relevantly similar in terms of dialectical power, is I think you can line up these things in terms of degrees of sort of acceptance and uniformity among philosophers. So you can, take the determinable disjunctive case. Almost everyone agrees with that. On the other side, there's the identity of indiscernibles case. Almost no one agrees with that. There's all these hard intermediate cases. What about, can there be primitive disposition? Some people say yes, some people say no. Can there be primitive morality? Lots of people, there's this intense debate. Some people say yes, some people say no. So I think you can sort of line up these things in terms of the super obvious cases, disjunctive facts need explanations of the disjuncts. And then you get you can get steadily more controversial until you get to Leibniz with arguments against substantival space, arguments for modal collapse, arguments for necessary, the principle of identity of indiscernibles. So I think there could be this sort of continuum where you want to get on the bus at the beginning, and then you start wanting to get off the bus, but it's unclear exactly where you want to get off the bus. So I think that's obviously different in kind than the kind of degrees in the mereology case, but I think it might play the same dialectical role of it's hard to know where to get off the bus. So yeah, those are some responses to the vagueness and similarity thing. But also, I think, even if it wasn't totally analogous, I don't know if that would be a big problem for me. So anyway, so I try to put on both hats. Yeah.
Can I ask a separate question?
I'm getting lazy.
Okay, excellent. That's
It's
great.
all going to hell.
That's so what do you think of this argument? Here are three options. Either nothing's funny,
Okay.
some but not everything is funny, or
Okay.
everything's funny.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to give you, here's my argument against nothing's
Yeah, I
funny.
know what you're saying. I have the response. So can I just
Well,
say
let me.
the response? Okay.
All right. Does everyone see where this is going? You know, I had
Okay.
funny examples
Okay.
and stuff. You know, but
Yeah, so-
okay. So and then you know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't know where to draw the line.
Yeah.
You can use the word arbitrary if you
Yeah,
want.
great.
You can say if it's vague.
Great,
Blah blah blah.
totally.
I feel no pressure whatsoever to
I
think that
completely agree.
everything is funny.
And I think that's disanalogous. So I think this is basically analogous to the deflationary kind of thing in the meta philosophy section. So I think if you think concepts like explanation and necessity are kind of like funny, then I think, yeah, there's going to, I think if you do that, my answer was, look, you're going to be an easy rotor, and you think there is going to be a dividing line, and moreover, that dividing line is going to be a function of ultimately messy, arbitrary, contingent features of human psychology. I think the same thing about funny. I think I should be an easy rotor, and I think there's going to be some dividing line, but it's going to be this super vague, messy, arbitrary dividing line that's ultimately a function, of course, of human psychology. So I think ultimately, if you take the metaphilosophical approach, like if you take necessity and explanation like funny, then I think it goes. But I think I wanted to put the argument as a conditional. Like suppose we take these concepts super seriously. What's necessary and what has an explanation. Then I think it's totally disanalogous to the funny case. But I agree that if you're inclined to be a deflationist and take it like funny,
I think
then
I picked a bad example.
Okay.
Funny is too easily treated deflationarily.
Okay.
Everything is a brontosaurus.
Okay.
You know, I don't know. You do the evolutionary stuff. There's going to be it's going to be
Okay.
arbitrary. So I just meant it feels like for almost any predicate you pick, it's really hard to draw.
Yeah. Okay. So what would I say with the brontosaurus? I would. Yeah. I guess it would. Yeah. The symmetrical sequence. I would say what is it to be a brontosaurus? And
But I think species are arbitrary.
That's fine.
But, yeah, I guess I think it is an interesting case to consider. But yeah. I think it's a good case.
Breaking all sorts of rules and stuff. I'm just going to throw in no. But I wouldn't rule it out at this point. It feels to me like saying, well, if you treat necessity explanation as conventional or whatever, really you just have to do explanation. Just like really you just have to do funny.
That's true.
So you could say, your question is, let's define funny as necessarily you have to laugh.
Okay.
You know, and it's like, yeah, okay, you could, you know, but you know, just go fuzzy on funny.
Yeah.
And I think you're okay.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Does the fact that every fact has an explanation have an explanation?
I think it's a very good question. I have a whole other paper on that actually. But
Oh, so sorry, but
yeah, it would.
against it.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. Here's one. I'll say. I think it. I think the answer is yes. If it's true, yes. And there's a question of what is the explanation. I'll just say one explanation you could give based on the things I've said here, but I think you should say something different. And I have this paper where I try to say something different, but it would be way too long. But you could argue something like this. First, you give an explanation for why the modal PSR is true. By modal PSR, I mean necessities need explanations. And there, I think you can give a totally independent argument that other people have given. I've tried to give something like it in terms of Rod's necessity or whatever. Then you say, OK, so we've explained why modal PSR is true. And then you argue that if the PSR were false, then the modal PSR would be false. So you basically try to argue from the modal PSR to the global PSR. You think, we have the modal PSR. And if the PSR would be violated, then the modal PSR would be violated because there would be the structure of modal space would be arbitrary. So the only way to satisfy the modal PSR, which we have independent reason for, is the global PSR. Ultimately, I'm not super satisfied with that argument. I think there's much more to say. But I think that would be an attempt based on the ideas here. But
all of the statements you utter seem to be statements about very interesting facts, and do they do tell an
So I said the modal PSR, and I think you can explain that. And then I said there's this conditional claim that if modal PSR, then global PSR. And then I mean, I tried to, basically my motivations of, basically if the hard road can't be done, then that would explain why it's true, because well, either the hard road can be done in an explicable way or not. If it can't be done in an explicable way, then a violation of the global PSR would imply a violation of the modal PSR, and the modal PSR has to be true. So the regress stop is, can the hard road be completed in an explicable way? I think if it just can't be, and that's just going to be a modal question, is there such a thing, then that would explain the global PSR. Ultimately, I think more has to be said, but that's an attempt based on the things I've said here.
So one question is which facts are explained by some other fact. Another question is which facts are explained by which other facts. So suppose that we take some fact arbitrarily, we pick A, and now we want to know which facts explain A. And it looks like there are three possibilities. We can say none of them explain A, but that seems wrong, especially if we picked it arbitrarily. It might be a fact with an explanation. We could say some of them explain A, but some don't. But now it looks like we're going to have a hard project of saying why B explains A, but C doesn't. So it looks like there's a third option. We could say every fact explains A. So we end up with a view you might call explanatory universalism. Perhaps a feature, it entails the PSR. So on this way of thinking, the problem with the PSR isn't that it's too ambitious, it's that it's not ambitious enough.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there are, I mean, I like these parity cases, but I just think, I mean, in particular cases, it's obvious, like, take a disjunctive fact, P or Q. What explains it? Oh my God, it's arbitrary. No, it's not. It's just P or Q, whatever. So I think it's just, I think the crucial thing is the sort of, yeah, I mean, I tried to distinguish different ways you can do sometimes, like easy road, hard road, and try to argue against those, et cetera. I think I would want to look at this particular fact, and I think in a lot of cases it's going to be obvious. So I guess I would just want to see the whole dialectic run in terms of easy road, hard road, and there's no kind of explanation. But I like the parity, and obviously if it worked, that would be bad for me. But yeah.
Great, thanks. This was super cool. I just had a few places in the against the hard road section where I was like, not getting it. So, for example, a small point was that you were saying, oh, if this is a relabeling, it's not an explanation. It seemed there like you were assuming like, oh, anything that can be broadly construed as relabeling can never explain. And I was thinking, well, it depends. I mean, if you want the kind of ordinary notion of explanation, maybe a lot of explanation proceeds by something that could be construed as relabeling. Like if you think facts about water can be explained by facts about H2O. So that was like one place where I was thinking. Then second, even setting that aside, suppose we say, oh no, it can't be relabeling, so I have to be committed to a notion of fundamentality where it's like this separate, it's like a kind of property of facts or something, and then explanation is a separate thing. Then I was really not getting the point about we still get the same questions that arise, because I thought what's happening here is we're trying to give an argument that there is an explanation in terms of like an answer to the question in terms of fundamentality, but we don't have the full answer, because for the full answer we'd have to say exactly which facts are fundamental. But we can convince ourselves that there is that there, like on this worldview, there is going to be an answer, and once we are in possession of the answer by filling in which facts are fundamental, we're going to be able to answer all of these questions. So I was feeling a little bit of, and then the last thing is like, would you be happier with the fundamentality approach if you had some kind of independent grip on it? Like if I said atomic facts, where atomic means like a partless object having a perfectly natural property, like would that help with that worry? So sorry.
Great.
I threw too much there.
So yeah, the relabeling thing, I'm wondering if this is one of the like if I think I can make the point I want to make without using the phrase relabeling, and I'm not sure if the worry would re-arise there. So basically my worry about the essences, worlds, fundamentality stuff is that they sort of violate the lesson I give in the handout, that they don't give clear, unambiguous, non-arbitrary answers to all the sort of controversial kinds of facts. And that's the sense in where it's a relabeling, like all the same questions arise on those. And so with like the water H2O case, yeah, perhaps that's a case where there's a certain sense in which saying something's H2O is a relabeling of water, and perhaps on certain kinds of explanations that counts as an explanation. But I think I can grant that without, while keeping to my lesson in that section. But yeah, so you said take the fundamentality approach, and then we can convince ourselves that there's an answer as to which things are fundamental. And I guess I'm worried about that. So take the take the analogy of the mereology question. So take in the fundamentality case, it seems sort of, you might think like, look, it's just obvious that certain facts are not fundamental, like the water bottle, and certain facts are, like the electron or something. So there has to be some kind of dividing line, even though we can't find it. I'm worried that you could say the same thing about the mereology case. You can say, look, it's just obvious that some things form fusions, like the water bottle, and some things don't, like the fusion of the table and the Eiffel Tower. And so we just have to, there has to be sub-stories, so we have to find it. But I'm inclined to think in the mereology case, you should sort of revise your commonsensical judgments. Like it might seem obvious that some things are fundamental and some things aren't, or it might seem obvious that some things form fusions and some things don't. But when you start trying to find out some principle of non-arbitrary dividing line and fail, I think insofar as you try and fail, you should maybe think maybe the starting point was wrong and there isn't this kind of obvious dividing line. So I'm worried.
Sorry, but I was considering the view where you think it's like there's this property fundamentality.
Oh.
Some states of affairs have it. So it's sort of part of my worldview that there are answers to these questions, because it's just a property of state of affairs. So for everything, either it has it or not.
Okay, so there can be this. So we have this property, but then there's this, this question of which kinds of facts, have to have it, and which kinds of facts don't have to have it, and saying that there's this property doesn't give you any of those answers. So I just think, I think it's just I think we might be agree that it's a very incomplete story. Maybe we just disagree about how confident we can be that there is this, because suppose I think, there's this property fundamentality, but there's this question, which kinds of things are such that it's necessary that it lacks that property and necessary that it has that property, and it's unclear how to decide the cases, and just saying that there's a property doesn't help us. So there's a question of,
Sorry, I'm just going to, one minute.
Yeah, sorry.
I was thinking there must be some principle that you're invoking to say, if we thought there was an explanation, we would thereby have answers to all these questions. I'm thinking, why is that? I have a worldview. On my worldview, I can convince myself that there's going to be an explanation, but I don't have answers to these questions.
No.
I'd have to learn a lot more about the world before
That's a good.
I have answers.
So I was presupposing that whatever the explanation is, it's going to be sensitive to the actual line that you drew. So suppose someone draws a line where like the moral facts need to be explained, the dispositional ones won't. They're going to give some explanation as to why the line's there, and someone else who draws some particular other line will give some other explanation. So I was thinking, what explanation you give is highly sensitive to exactly where you draw the line. So I was thinking you have to draw a line before you can start giving an explanation, because the explanation is going to be sensitive to where exactly the line is drawn, I was thinking. But yeah, we should talk about that. But also you said atomic, and I don't, and you said and then you gave a characterization of atomic as something like without parts that has a perfectly natural property. But again, I think you can raise the same question. So you can ask, can moral properties be perfectly natural? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. Take the dispositional case. Can dispositional properties be perfectly natural? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. That's a very hard, controversial thing. Lots of people disagree. So I think even if I give you the concept of atomic property and perfect naturalness, I think, again, it's sort of these relabeling things where all the same questions arise, so it doesn't really help.
Thank you. So this is closely related to the previous question. I'm not sure if it's exactly a relabeling of the previous question. We'll find out. Whenever I had a problem with your major problem 2 for the hardliner, where you say it's just a relabeling. Because my thought was like, say we give the explanation you suggest, like the facts are fundamental and don't need explanations. And maybe we have some antecedent characterization of what fundamentality is. Maybe it's, ultimate ontological independence. I don't know. There's, a million different ways that you might want to try to characterize it. And I agree. I think whenever I give you that, that's not going to answer all of the questions about like when, about what is fundamental and what isn't. But that seems to me at least a different question, strictly speaking, from the what you're calling the special explanation question, even though it might have bearing on those debates, right? So like my antecedent characterization of fundamentality might tell me, might help me answer some of these things. But even if it doesn't help me answer all of these things, right? It doesn't seem to me that the hardliner's opponent is in a better epistemic situation. So at least dialectically, I don't think it's that effective to say like, well, you haven't given an answer. And it's like, well, even if you think that there is an explanation, right? It seems like we're still debating about what the best explanation should be. In which case, it doesn't seem that my answer of not giving you any great explanation of, say, dispositions is superior to saying, I think there's an explanation, but ask me later.
So I totally agree that it's not, if by relabeling you mean same question, I agree it's not a relabeling because fundamentality has all this baggage to it, it's a particular kind of explanation. I think it might be a worry about the fundamentality approach because the PSR just says that everything has some explanation or other, so it might be a worry that, if you have antecedent views that the only kind of explanation is fundamentality or something, but if you have antecedent views that, no, there could be other kinds of explanation, then I think that might be a worry about the approach because the PSR is just that everything has some explanation, and so that might just be missing some kinds of explanation. In terms of I think I just grant that it's a different question, and perhaps if you have a substantive characterization of fundamentality, it might help you, but I'd want to see the details of that, of how it helps you in these particular cases. But then you said, look, the hard, what did I call it? The hard rotor. Hardliner, hard rotor. The hard rotor's opponents are in a similar situation. So there's multiple different opponents to the hard rotor. There's the easy rotor, which is maybe an opponent of the hard rotor, and then there's the PSR, which is another opponent, and then there's I think no one, I guess, has defended the anti-PSR, that in principle everything can be left, or in principle anything. But yeah. Oh, me. Who was trying to defend the PSR. Yeah, I was thinking. So take the special composition question. I think if you're a restrictivist, you have this kind of project of where's the dividing line, why is it there rather than somewhere else. But if you're a universalist, you just don't have that problem. You're not drawing any dividing line. So I think, and I think the same thing here is if you're a hardliner, you have this problem. You have to draw a line and explain why it's there rather than somewhere else. But if you're sort of a universalist, then you just don't have this problem of drawing a line. So why is it that if the opponents, I don't know if I like the PSR, but let me assume I like the PSR. Why is it that I'm in a bad state? Because I feel like I'm the sort of universalist about mereology, that I don't have to be in the business of drawing lines and explaining why the lines are the way they are.
Sorry, can I say one more thing? The thought was just that if you are a universalist, right, and you're granting that like all of these things have explanations, that you still need to paint a picture of what those explanations should look like then, and that doesn't seem to me obviously better than the hard rotor saying, I don't know, but
no, I think that's a really good point. So so with respect to this particular project of drawing lines or whatever, the hard road looks hard. With respect to the project of like trying to explain everything, I totally agree that PSR looks very hard. So okay. I totally agree. I think it's a different project, but I totally agree that it's a hard one.
Hey, David. Thanks for a really interesting talk. So I'm worried this will not be a helpful question, but I don't know. Maybe you can help me even if the question doesn't help you. Okay. So I had a curious reaction to your argument against never. I started out thinking, oh yeah, I'll just totally grant that. I can think about something else while you give the argument. And then when you gave the argument, I got less. At first I thought I got less and less sure that it's true. I think actually the proper description is I became convinced that sometimes is the right answer. So really I think that there's an easy sometimes answer, and that's that all necessary truths require explanations, but no contingent ones. And I guess when you were going through the examples, I would think, well, is this necessary or is it contingent? And then insofar as it was contingent, I thought, that could be true and not have an explanation. So I guess I was thinking, imagine someone setting up like a simulation or God or whatever. I mean, it just sort of seems like for any contingent fact whatsoever, you could write that in by hand or set up a computer to kind of randomly generate it in your simulation. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I just need more sleep or not, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so
so like the disjunction, for example, I mean, the disjunctive case seemed the strongest, so maybe I'll...
Yeah, so I was thinking, so this is going to be sensitive to your background views about explanation, but like suppose you like grounding, then like take like there are donkeys. That's like a very contingent thing. But grounding people will say, oh, that has in virtue of this donkey and that donkey, and donkeys in virtue of particles, blah, blah. So, and you might think, yeah, there just couldn't be fundamental donkeys. Donkeys have to be explained in terms of their parts and blah, blah. So I think you could sort of press that just extensionally, that there are plenty of contingent facts that necessitate explanations. And I guess I would press that. Yeah, do I have? But because you started by saying maybe you were sympathetic to never, but then you gave a easy sometimes. But should I say, or should I try to justify why never is better? Or are you still somewhat partial to never? Or maybe I shouldn't ask the questioner questions.
I guess at first I was in my head restricting the principle
Okay.
of contingent facts, and
Yeah.
so I was thinking
Okay.
never, but then
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so one kind of example is the grounding stuff, even with causal stuff. So if you have the sort of essentialist view that I was talking about earlier, like sort of like origin essentialism or something, you might think, contingent fact that I exist, but necessarily there's some kind of causal story that brought about my existence in terms of my parents or whatever. And so that's another kind of case where it's contingent, but it necessitates an explanation. So I think you can both give causal, they're both causal and grounding stories for why contingent facts require explanations. But obviously those are controversial, you could reject both of those. So maybe there's a workable view that rejects all of these.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, David. This was beautiful. Two quick questions. One is just clarification. Given the way you set up the question and your arguments, why isn't PSR formulated as every fact requires an explanation? And also, in fact, I think it should be necessarily every fact requires an explanation. That's what you're working with, right?
Totally agree. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, here's the question that I think is more interesting, I hope. In your responses to the hard road, you are really reading the view in question from an intuitionistic point of view. You're really looking for a witness of that existential quantifier that you get when you say, and moreover, there is some explanation for why it is exactly there and not somewhere else. Yeah. And you consider a few candidates, if and only ifs, and but that's fine. But really, that's a much stronger view that there is such an explanation, and in fact that I can offer you, give it to you. I wonder whether one might, in fact, defend the sometimes answer by going the hard road and taking that existential quantifier classically. There is one. I'm not in a position to offer one, but I can give you an argument for why there is such a thing. And often this is how proofs go, right? I can show that there exists something without actually, that there exists a P without actually being in a position to exhibit a P.
Yeah, I mean, so if I were to reject the argument, I'd probably go this way. So I think there's this interesting epistemic question as to, in the absence of any kind of way to fill in the details, how confident should you be in the existential without saying anything concrete about the details? And I think I just think of the analogy, so take the special composition question. If someone said, look, obviously there are tables, and obviously there are no tables in Eiffel Towers, so there has to be some line. I'm inclined to think, I'm skeptical of there being a line unless and until you give me some help as to why some plausible story might be right. Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to think the same thing here. So maybe I would, if you share that intuition in the mereology case, I would maybe try to argue that you should have it here, but maybe you don't in the mereology case. But I mean, ultimately, I think, I don't have an argument that it can't work. It's an interesting epistemic question of how confident should we. I think we should just do it inductively. I challenge people to do this, and insofar as people can't, I think we should raise our credence that it can't be done. But I really want people to start trying to do it. at least try, basically. So, but yeah.
Just two quick things. One thing I was noticing when you went from general explanation to special explanation, you had parenthesis S in the general, and that was sort of dropping out in the special. I found that it's particularly relevant in that, suppose we had the general, the fact S, so we allow it as a plural to plural, where the singulars are limiting case, then we could rehabilitate easily a version of Peter's old argument, or we could think of it as a relation between rigid properties of a higher type of facts, because there'll be a limiting case where the plurality we're explaining is all the facts, and then it would have a generalization of irreflexivity. Then we'd have some elementary grounds for a not always in the plural. So I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that there was that subtle shift. The second thing I wanted to say, as you know, quite a few contemporary metaphysicians are intentionalists. And I wanted to just say something quickly about how the game changes in an intentionalist setting. One way that it changes is all of the ground examples look no good. Like, P or P is P. It's very red or red is it's red. So, and same for pretty much all of these look like they're higher order identities floating around, and then that doesn't look like fodder for explanation. What there will be, this is second quick thing, this whole brute necessity is a very difficult ideology in that setting. There's just top. That this brute necessity thing is very hard ideology to make out. But the good news, if you're in that setting, the sort of thing to look roughly at as a facsimile as a worldly sort of thing in the ballpark of what you're talking about won't be grounding, but it will be something like causation. So a sort of good place to start as a little toy model is counterfactual dependence. So here's a thing, a very well defined PSR kind of thing. For any contingent truth, I mean, let's leave top out of it. For any contingent truth, is there a distinct contingent truth on which it counterfactually depends? And actually, I was calculating through in the Stormaker models, you get yes. You get full PSR as a yes answer in that setting. I mean, that's a pretty good. So that makes me think we don't want to be rushing too much to think, infinite regressive. No, yes, and I'll prove it to you in a Stormaker model. So I thought that even if you weren't an intentionalist, as a sort of little warm-up, it might be interesting to see that relations like that can satisfy pervasive, at least one-to-one PSR. That was it.
Great. So, yeah, I basically just totally agree that maybe I should have put a parentheses S on the special explanation question. And yeah, because there's different views on there about like whether grounding is singular, plural, et cetera. And I wanted, I guess, to be neutral. I think it would be interesting if it turns out that it's not neutral to my argument and different things happen if you put the S or not. And I haven't really thought about that, so I don't really have anything intelligent to say here, sadly. But the intentionalist thing, I mean, I'm happy if the PSR falls out of Stalnaker's model, so I'll be happy with that. Yeah. I guess, so I'm not super in the weeds of intentionalism, but I would try to bring it back down to earth in the sense that, I don't think these questions go away. So take personal identity fission case. Can you be the one on the left? Yes or no? That's a very specific kind of. So intentionalist, there's still a question of what you say, and it doesn't go away.
You don't become lefty. You either are lefty or not. There's no temporary identity. So
but that's a question. Can I become lefty and not righty, even though?
No, you don't become. You either are lefty or you are righty.
But
so we've got this name, lefty and righty. Yes.
Okay, but there's another view where there is no world where I become lefty or am lefty or righty because it would be arbitrary.
Let me just say how to think about it if you're an intentionalist. Okay. Like Hesperus is the proposition that Hesperus is phosphorus. I am lefty is the proposition that lefty is lefty. But they're just the same proposition. So there can't be. It can't be. You can't be starting to think, there's no. The explanation for lefty is lefty is different to I'm lefty.
But some people think there's no world. Say I'm pre-fission. Yeah, I think I could say that. Or I could say that, or what I was going to say. But yeah, let lefty be a definite description.
Oh, I was
for,
having it as, I was treating it as a rigid name.
But
introduced
basically, my point is I think all of these first order cases are going to arise, like similar like in the non-Humean case, there's this big debate, can there be like primitive dispositions and stuff? And I don't think being intentionalist makes that go away. I think there's still going to be that debate. So I'm inclined to think that most or maybe even all of these debates can be run, maybe differently tweaked, but it's I'd be worried if intentionalism just like stopped all of
I
meta-ethics
disagree with
and
you. I mean, every identity, higher order and at any order, is just top.
Sure,
right?
I
so
agree
let's
with that.
take the height of the sets.
But what do we think about dispositions?
Okay, let's take the height of the sets. Like, suppose I say, I pick a height. I say, maybe it's that height. You say, that's arbitrary. I say, well, if it is true, then here's a higher order identity that's true. To be a set is to be a set of that height.
Yeah.
Or lower. And then that's an identity. It's top. It's just top. So you can't, you know, it doesn't, you don't need to explain that. And so I don't know how to keep the thing going. And it'll just be like that again and again and again.
For dispositions, personal identity,
all of these. Okay. It'll all be like that. There'll be higher order identities, and they'll all be top.
I mean, I think we're going to dinner later. We should talk about that more there.
Let us now thank David. And I would like to thank all of our speakers. Let me say something about all of our speakers and our questioners as well. Oh, darn it. And this, I got this from John Keller. I can say of all of you, your work, your aims are ambitious. You made your case with the utmost precision, lucidity, and fairness. Your work is a model of how systematic metaphysics ought to be pursued. Maybe epistemology too, some of you. I didn't agree with a lot of your conclusions, but you were the ones to beat, and so on. Well, that's all things that David Lewis said about Peter, so we'll give David Lewis the last word. Thanks, Peter, for being the occasion of this, and let's keep reading Peter. I don't know if it's your next thing, is coming out in Oxford Studies in Metaphysics. There's probably something else coming out elsewhere, and there's 4 books to come. But I can tell you the next thing that I'm publishing by him in Oxford Studies in Metaphysics is an excellent paper on paraphrase strategies for nihilists. So whether you're a nihilist or not, you're going to want to check that out. Let's have one more round of applause for Peter and his contribution.